Hi, I'm Pastor Jason Van Bemmel from Forest Hill Presbyterian Church, and this is Ask the Pastor. And today we're dealing with a very festive and seasonally appropriate question, and that is Christmas really a pagan holiday? Is Christmas really a pagan holiday? Well, you can see me sitting here in front of our family Christmas tree, and the stockings are hung by the chimney with care. So you can probably guess my answer to this question. Except my answer to this question might be a little bit different than you think. The critics of Christmas, those who say that Christians should not be celebrating Christmas, will point out a couple of things. They will say, first of all, we don't have any record of the earliest church celebrating Christmas for like the first 200 years of the church. And if they did, there was disagreement over exactly when the birth date of Jesus was. They'll say that December 25th was picked in the mid to late 200s because it corresponded with Saturnalia, which was a Roman feast celebrating the god Saturn, who is the god of joy and frivolity, and it was a time for merrymaking in the middle of winter. They'll also say it coincided with Sol Invictus, which was a festival to celebrate the rise of the unconquerable sun. And both of these Roman festivals roughly corresponded with the winter solstice, which comes every year around December 21st and is pretty close to when we celebrate Christmas on December 25th. So they'll say all these things, and they'll say really what this is a Christian attempt to co-opt a pagan Roman holiday and try to make it about Jesus, and therefore we shouldn't be celebrating Christmas at all. Now, my response to that is to say they're probably right in a lot of what they're saying. It's probably true that the early church did not have a big Christmas celebration time for the first couple hundred years of the church. We don't know exactly when Jesus was born, and it does seem probable that December 25th was picked because it did line up with some Roman festivals. Whether it exactly lines up with Saturnalia or Sol Invictus, the history is honestly kind of clouded, especially when you're talking about the practices of the early church. There were such waves of intense persecution against the church in the 200s that many Christian records and histories and accounts were burned and destroyed by the Roman emperors in the mid to late 200s. So we just don't know a lot about the history, but I'm just going to say, okay, let's say that all of their criticisms are correct. Just for the sake of argument, let's say that all their criticisms are correct. That is not a good reason to not celebrate Christmas, and to celebrate Christmas in, right after the winter solstice, December 25th. And here's why in a nutshell. First and foremost, Jesus' birth is certainly very centrally important to the Bible, to our Christian faith, and to human history. Two of the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, begin with accounts of Jesus' birth. And John's Gospel begins with a theological account of Jesus' birth, of the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among us. So Christmas, the story of the birth of Jesus, is in the Bible. The birth of Jesus literally split time in half. We measure things as BC and AD, and the dividing point of all human history, the reason why we're in the year 2019, even for those who want to use the politically correct terminology of BCE and BC and whatever, okay, it's Jesus' birth that splits time in half. It's Jesus' birth that is the turning point of redemptive history. There's a reason why we go from Old Testament to New Testament, from promise to fulfillment, from shadow to reality, with the coming of the Son of God into the world. It is the turning point of human history and the turning point of redemptive history. And I think it's actually perfect to celebrate it in the middle of winter, December 25th, a few days after the winter solstice, because it is the turning point of the year. Most pagan religions in European tradition, whether that's Celtic or Nordic or Roman, they had some sort of midwinter, now they say midwinter, right after the winter solstice, We count that as the beginning of winter. That's a topic for another day. But they had some sort of midwinter festival, celebration, feast, because it was the turning point of the year. There had been increasing darkness, 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 and now there's increasing light, light, light. And so as the year turns on its hinge from darkness to light, there is within humanity a natural desire to celebrate the birth of the unconquerable sun, Sol Invictus, right? To celebrate the joy and the festivity of that's represented by the god Saturn. To celebrate, in Nordic tradition, we don't know when they started bringing evergreen trees into their homes. We don't know if that's a pre-Christian tradition or if it was already a Christian tradition. Our best account of the history was that Nordic peoples already brought evergreen trees into their homes as a sign of the hope of life in the middle of winter. But that Boniface, who was the great missionary to the northern Germanic peoples, that he taught them to think about the evergreen tree as a symbol of the Trinity, because there are three corners to the evergreen tree. And he said that's emblematic of the triune God. So the history is fuzzy, but here's the point. Many of the elements of what we call pagan religion, of course they're false and they're superstitious and they're false gods, but at the core, many of the elements that are there in the mythologies represent the longing of the human heart for things that are beyond this world, for things that are supernatural, for things that are eternal, for things that are deeply true, for things that are filled with hope and joy. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were great lovers of pagan mythology. They were great Christian authors, but they were great lovers of pagan mythology. And if you read the Chronicles of Narnia, you'll see many elements of pagan mythology mixed throughout: fauns and satyrs and centaurs and minotaurs and dryads, and all these things that are taken from paganism are woven into the Chronicles of Narnia, which is a Christian story, an essentially Christian story. Tolkien the same way. If you read The Lord of the Rings, he takes elements of paganism and he weaves them throughout The Lord of the Rings to tell what is a distinctly Christian story of hope. What Tolkien and Lewis both believed is that the myths of human culture reflect something that God has placed into human hearts and into human culture, which are echoes of eternity, seeds of truth, hints, pointers, directors, that ultimately, if followed, would point us to Christ. After all, Christ is the unconquerable Son, whose birth really did turn the world from darkness to light. Christ is the one who comes into the world, and whose coming into the world brings joy and brings hope and brings life in the midst of a world that is filled with death and darkness and gloom. Even the very timing of Jesus' birth, in the days of Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, the most powerful man to ever rule over the world in human history to that point, right? Jesus comes at that time because as a human empire, the Roman Empire had grown to unprecedented power and strength, oppressing the world under its rule. Jesus comes to bring his rule, to bring freedom and light and hope. And the truth is that if you look at most of our Christmas traditions and symbols, whatever meaning some of them may have had to some pagans, they have become for us deeply and richly Christian. You'll notice that the green evergreen tree behind me has red ornaments on it and has white lights throughout it. I mentioned Boniface earlier, who taught the Nordic peoples to look at the evergreen tree as a symbol of the Trinity, because it's one tree and it has 3 points and 3 parts to it. Not that God has parts. Don't take that as a theologically precise statement, but it's a symbol that points us in the direction of a 3-in-1 God, according to Boniface's teaching. Well, it was Martin Luther in 1525, as far as we know, who first suggested putting a light on the tree. And that was to symbolize the light of Christ shining in the darkness. You notice an evergreen tree, when the lights are off, is very dark. But the light of Christ shines in the darkness. And that's the birth of Christ coming into the world. Now, the red on the tree represents the blood of Christ, who shed his blood on a tree so that we might have forgiveness and we might have life. So all of these things that have may or may not, the history's muddy, have some roots in paganism, their current meaning is certainly not pagan. Their current meaning is deeply and profoundly Christian. And we should remember that when we celebrate Christmas. Now, some people will say, well, having a Christmas tree in your house or having stockings by the fire or celebrating Christmas, it's just like celebrating God, worshiping God through the golden calf like they did in Exodus. It's worshiping God, but it's worshiping God through man-made ways. And that's not a good analogy at all for this one simple reason. We don't worship God through a Christmas tree. We don't worship God through mistletoe or poinsettias. It's how we celebrate the birth of Jesus, but they are not elements of our worship of God. Nobody in this household bows down before that Christmas tree as though it were a representation of God. No. But looking at it shows us beauty and life and joy and hope and light in the darkness. And all of that reminds us of Christ. So I say, let's celebrate Christmas with joy, with passion, but remembering that the real reason to have joy and hope at Christmas is not because it's winter and snow is pretty, but because Jesus came into the darkness of this world and he brought the light of eternal life in his birth in this world. So let's celebrate Christmas and let's celebrate Christ in Christmas. This has been Ask the Pastor. I'm Pastor Jason Van Bemmel from Forest Hill Presbyterian Church.